Thank you so much to our speakers, Wensi Liang, Dr. Andres Lozano, Sope Owaje, and Mark Hennick. And thank you to our audience. Taking a look, we have audience members registered from all over Vancouver, Edmonton, St. John, as well as Uruguay, the Philippines, Mexico, from all over. Great to see you. We encourage you joining us from home to share this conversation on social media. You can tag us at the Walrus on all the major social media platforms, and the hashtag is hashtag Walrus Talks. Now for our Q&A session. We're doing something special tonight. We have 6 copies of Mark Hennick's memoir, So-Called Normal, to give away. If you participate in the chat, it could be a comment, it could be a question, you will be considered, and we will be picking 6 people and notifying the winners after tonight's event. Our moderator this evening is Toronto Star mental health reporter Nadine Youssef. Nadine, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me. I just want to thank the Walrus for the opportunity to moderate today's event, especially after hearing really thoughtful and engaging talks from our speakers this evening. Thank you again to Wensi and Dr. Lozano, Sope, and Mark. I know I have a lot of questions and our audience members probably do as well. So we are going to start our Q&A session. If you have a question, you can ask it in the Zoom chat box below. And yeah, without further ado, we'll get started. I have a question. My first question is for Wensi. Wensi, you spoke about loneliness, and I think loneliness is something that most of us have experienced in one way or another in the last year, dealing with social isolation and just, the pandemic. And I do know that people have largely resorted to virtual means to connect with loved ones as the virus continues to keep us physically distanced from one another. And I was curious if there's research that suggests whether this virtual connection alone can alleviate the ill effects of loneliness that you sort of spoke about, or if there's something intrinsically valuable in physical closeness that we just can't replicate until maybe we can really see each other again.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nadine. And yeah, I haven't seen a lot of research in terms of like whether the virtual means of communications can replicate um, the face-to-face. But there is a lot of research about what we're missing with the face-to-face and like the in-person communication, especially when it comes to human touch. There's a lot of research into just how important touch is to even human development, neurodevelopment, and so we are missing that huge piece. But I think like in the absence of that, it really is what I had wanted to say is it's so important to just pick up the phone and call. One of the remedies for loneliness, really, I mean, the ultimate remedy for loneliness is to show other people that you care for them and that you're cared for back. So yeah, I do think it, in the absence of face-to-face, this is kind of what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, social distancing is important so that we can keep each other safe. And I am grateful that we have all these sort of means to connect, regardless of that, and even to be able to do this today. So yeah, thank you so much for your answer, Wensi. My next question is actually for Dr. Lozano. You spoke about treatment options for people who are suffering with depression, where they've tried every other sort of treatment and it didn't work, and this is sort of the new frontier, so to speak. I'm imagining there's quite a number of people who would probably like to have the opportunity to be able to try a procedure like this and see if it would work for them. So I'm wondering, where you are in your research, and what is the timeline before we can see a procedure like this available as a treatment option for the general population in Canada?
Well, thank you for your question. So indeed, we are looking at treating people that are the most extremely refractory patients, the people that are the most ill of the ill, people that are suicidal, people who, whose life is threatened by their depression, who've had chronic depression for years and years, in many cases, decades, who've tried multiple drugs, who've tried psychiatric therapy, even electroconvulsive therapy. So really, you must have tried all of these things first to be eligible to an experimental therapy. So this is still considered an investigational therapy in that we still don't know enough about how safe and effective it is. So it looks like it might be safe. It seems to be quite safe. We do this type of DBS procedure in many other conditions like Parkinson's, for example. So it looks like it's quite safe. The issue is how effective is it and how long does the benefit last? If you're going to go through an operation, you want to know that it has enduring benefit. So we're still at a research stage where we are now presenting this kind of data to the regulatory agencies, and they have to assess it and decide whether there is sufficient evidence that it's safe and effective to allow more widespread and generalized use. But for the time being, it's still considered an investigational procedure.
Right. It's still really interesting to know that, we're sort of, there's a lot of progress that's being done in terms of, treatment for people with mental illness, and definitely a long way to go. So yeah, thank you so much for the research that you're doing and also for answering my question. I do have some questions from the audience as well. So this question is from Allison, and I will ask it to Mark if that was okay. Mark, Allison is asking, what would you recommend to people in deep depression right now, I guess, in terms of just words to help them or anything of the sort? What would you sort of recommend if somebody's finding themselves in deep depression right now?
I think what I would always try to recommend to myself anyway, because I think we need to practice what we preach, is to be gentle with yourself, that this is hard. I think for me, again, one of the worst symptoms of my own depression was this critical mind, this hyper-judgmentalism, that I should be getting better, I should get out of bed, I should all over myself, until I just ended up feeling worse and worse, and it wasn't helpful. So be gentle with yourself, permit yourself to feel your feelings fully, even though it's hard. But also, I think the second half of this is be willing to push yourself as well, to do things that are hard, because depression has a lot of habitual pieces to it that aren't serving you. We tend to believe everything we think, that we can't get out of bed, for example. And that may not necessarily be true. We might fully believe it, but even if the best we can do that day is drag ourselves out of bed to get a shower, then at least that's a little bit better than sliding back. So do what you can, meet yourself where you are, and be gentle with yourself. I think that's, we could all stand to do that, especially those who are in the deepest pit of depression.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the times we forget to be kind to ourselves. So yeah, I do appreciate your comments, Mark. Thank you. I do have another question from the audience. This is from Elaine to Sope. Sope, Elaine is asking, how can the social assistance sector, like a food bank, help Black, Indigenous, people of color individuals with informing about mental health options? I don't know if you had any thoughts to share about that.
Yes, thank you for that question. First of all, when we talk about awareness and spreading awareness in our communities, these are some of the places that we want officials and people who work in mental health sectors to be visiting. We want them to be visiting places that are regularly attended, like churches or food banks, to really spread the word and to destigmatize any sorts of mental health issues that may be going on. A lot of people who visit food banks are also looking for that sort of support and could be looking for wider support as well. And so if food banks have, these services, these therapists, counselors, their numbers, all these sorts of resources at hand, ready to kind of share the information, present that to people who are maybe visiting, that would be like probably the biggest and best step in probably like really destigmatizing, because we want people to be able to have access as much as possible, for people to not be struggling to look for those resources, for those resources to be incredibly visible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sope. I have another question for Wency. Wency, one of the things that you mentioned in your talk is sort of how loneliness, one of the side effects of loneliness is sort of the rapid decline of people with dementia as a result of social isolation, not having someone to care for them, and not having sort of that social interaction to sort of keep their mind, I guess, healthy. And it's particularly alarming. And you know, this is one of those things that could be kind of irreversible even when the pandemic is long over. And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of insight on how healthcare workers and family members of those with dementia have tried to address this issue over the course of last year.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really challenging one, because for a long time, and still in some institutions, family members are not able to actually get in and be at their loved ones' bedsides. So there are some kind of sort of pilot projects that are underway that kind of use the virtual tools that are available to kind of help at least keep long-term care residents, for example, to keep them stimulated and keep them, still connected to their families. But yeah, I mean, it's really important for long-term care residents to have at least somebody to come in. One of the sort of experiments that is happening is in Vancouver. There's one home is using sort of pre-recorded videos for individuals with dementia, but pre-recorded videos of their families speaking to them. And that actually has been shown to actually be more effective than live, live sort of FaceTiming. Just kind of, it just, they can replay it whenever they want to, and just having that familiar voice and that familiar face seems to help.
That's really interesting. I didn't hear about that before. Thank you so much, Mansi, for sharing that. One of the audience members, Shreya, has a question for Dr. Lozano. The question is, in treatment-resistant depression, is there any understanding of how comorbid neurodivergent conditions like autism, for example, that are often underdiagnosed in adults impact whether DPS is appropriate or effective as treatment?
Yeah, I think we should emphasize that depression is really a disorder of the brain and is a malfunction in the brain. And it's very much like having diabetes, and you have, your blood sugar is too high. Here, we have areas of the brain that are overactive. And it can be because you're born that way or the environment is driving that circumstance. But I think it helps to destigmatize depression, that it's really a physical illness that can come and go and has a cycle. Of course, there are comorbid disorders, and depression can be part of other disorders. And furthermore, if you have any other illness, for example, a heart attack, if you're depressed, your tendency to die is much higher. So depression is a serious condition leading to death and suicide. But also, if you have any other chronic condition or a heart attack or kidney disease and so on, if you're depressed, you don't live as long. And so it adds to the morbidity of all medical conditions in addition.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lozano. Sope, I had a question for you from the audience as well, from Yelini. Yelini is asking, how do you find the balance between taking care of yourself and supporting your family member when you also deal with mental health challenges, especially in Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, where the focus is on the collective family culturally?
Thank you for that question. When it comes to being there for yourself, being there for those around you, there's a lot that can come into play. And one of the things that I take great pride in is understanding boundaries and creating safe boundaries for yourself and for others around you. Because just like when on the plane, they say you have to be able to put your mask on before you can help someone else put their oxygen mask on. You need to be able to care for yourself before you can care for those around you safely. A lot of BIPOC communities emphasize very community-wide support and a collective, which we take great pride in, working with each other, things like that. But it's also important to be able to take that time to care for yourself and create those boundaries. Because if you're not able to do that, oftentimes you end up neglecting both sides, and that can be harmful on its own. And when you want to be building a community, building the strength within a community, you want your own individual self to be as strong as can be for your community as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's important that we're healthy so that other people around us can be healthy, and we're able to take care of each other that way. Thanks for that, Sope. I do have a question from Mark as well, from Kathy, who's also an audience member. So Kathy's asking if you could give us some concrete tips on how to avoid cognitive rigidity, if you had any thoughts.
Wonderful question. I've experienced it myself so many times, but I've seen it working as a clinician too, where the more afraid you become, the sadder you become, the more difficult things become in your mind, the more you close down the more you focus in. It's almost this evolutionary imperative to wall yourself off and protect yourself. You don't want to open yourself up to the risk of potentially getting hurt, for example, in social interactions, because you already feel so much pain. So of course you protect yourself in that way. So I think the first step is noticing what you're doing, that if you're, for example, becoming more irritable, you find yourself disagreeing a lot more than usual with people. I'm a bit of a contrarian myself anyway, so that, having an understanding of your baseline helps. But recognizing if you just don't seem like you, according to the you that you know yourself as. So that's the first step, is noticing. And then pushing yourself to actually respond differently, to take a beat. That's one of my favorite concepts from humanistic psychology and mindfulness and many others, is that you can create a wider space between stimulus and response. That when something happens, an emotion, a thought, an event in the world, you don't have to go with your very first instinct, your very first thought or feeling. Thoughts and feelings are important, but they're data points. They're not necessarily facts. So when we widen the space, even just for a couple of seconds, it can allow our mind to relax into that a little bit more, rather than just bouncing off the bricks that we've already put around our perception. That's the way that I practice it myself, is to give space for wider thinking, but then also continuing to challenge myself to think differently as well, to ask myself that question: is this the only way that this particular issue, thought, feeling, situation could be thought of? Rather than falling into the echo chamber, not only in my own head, but in the social circles that I've surrounded myself with. So I think that's it. Noticing, creating some space in yourself, and intentionally exposing yourself to perception broadening experiences.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Those are definitely very concrete steps, and I appreciate your perspective on that. I also have a question for Wency from another audience member, Neil. Neil is asking, how do you deal with depression and social isolation when Zoom fatigue is so prevalent?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, it is. Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and there are a lot of people who are suffering from it. Well, I guess there are alternatives. For one thing, people have kind of forgotten just to pick up the phone, and like, I feel like sometimes we automatically go to Zoom when we can just call some, old-fashioned telephone. It's great. The other thing too is, where possible and when it's safe to do so, if you can go out for a walk with somebody, a socially distanced walk, do it. And the other thing is, this pandemic is not going to last forever, but the mental health effects and loneliness are. So, in whatever way you can, you know, when it's possible, meet in person.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of telephone calls as well. I could spend hours talking to friends on the phone, old friends, and I find that really helps me as well. And I didn't really used to go on walks that much, but since the pandemic started, it's been my go-to. And I know a lot of people have been trying new things just to see what works for them, even in the short term, so that they could sort of get through this, and hopefully kind of we can all come together one day when it's safe to do so. Thank you so much, Wency. So I have a question for Sope actually. Sope, one of the things that I was curious about from your perspective is just, you mentioned the mental health stigma that exists within BIPOC communities, and it's certainly something that I've experienced with my family as well. And I know it's difficult sometimes to challenge that stigma. And I wonder, like, how do you approach having these difficult conversations about mental health with your family and community at large? And how would you advise other BIPOC viewers who may be struggling to speak openly about issues related to mental health with their families and loved ones?
Yeah, thank you, Nadine. I think one of the biggest things in understanding why often a lot of BIPOC communities have a hard time discussing about mental health, most times there's not language for mental health in other communities. In my culture, I don't really know the translation for mental health. I don't think it exists really. And so that's often like the root where people are kind of just like, we don't have the language for that, so we don't often discuss. And two, weakness is something in BIPOC communities that there's no space for due to just the ideology and just the place that we've been put due to colonized structures, that we have to be strong. We have to work extremely hard, harder than other people have to work. So we don't have the space to show, you have depression, you're anxious, you'll hear, well, you'll have to get over it because you have lots to do for you to show, yourself in a sea of Europeans or, in a sea of white people. You have to show yourself, you have to prove yourself higher. And I think one of the biggest things that's helped me is simply understanding mental health in general and being able to come together, even with the smallest groups of people, where that will start with your parents, your siblings, having those conversations in themselves, and then start widening once you're able to have those conversations with your parents or the people who are closest to you in your community, where then they're able to understand and you're able to dive into different resources together to kind of open that mindset. Then you can start to broaden out and, with the help of your friends and your family, to really branch out and share with other people. That's how I kind of, it's gone for me. And I talk about that with other people in other communities. Once you start small and you branch out, you'll really see how quickly people are understanding that struggle is not normal. Struggling is not normal. And if you're struggling for so long, you stop realizing that struggling isn't normal and just take it as it is. But once you start explaining that and people start opening their minds, then it really does branch out.
Yeah, absolutely. It really starts with conversation and just, having those conversations, no matter how small, and, it does kind of grow and, ideas sort of branch out from there. Thank you so much, Sope, for your insight. I appreciate it. I have a question from the audience for Dr. Lozano. This is from Gail. Gail is asking, I've heard men die by suicide more often than women. Is it possible just as many men suffer from depression as women? However, they don't seek treatment or deny that they're depressed.
That's an excellent question. Depression affects all genders, all ages, and so on, but it does affect young people, and there's very good evidence that it's more common in women. So it is said that 9%, at any one time, 9% of women are depressed, and 6% of men are depressed. So there's quite clear evidence that indeed it is more common in women. As far as suicide, it's very different in men and women. It varies also from different countries. So for example, Japan and Scandinavia have a very high rate of suicide. Countries near the equator have a low rate of suicide. So we don't understand that exactly why it is. Men tend to choose different ways of committing suicide than women. Women tend to take overdoses. Men often do more violent forms of suicide, jumping off bridges, gunshots. And so the success rate of suicide in men is higher because of the techniques that they use than in women. So it looks like indeed there are important differences based on your gender, where you live, et cetera, that have an impact on your likelihood of getting depression and also your likelihood of suicide.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you so much for your insight. I have a question also from the audience for Mark, actually. This is from Jenny. So Jenny is asking, what advice would you give for someone hoping to support a friend or family member suffering severe depression? What questions should be asked to gauge what someone needs without making them feel obliged to contribute the same energy to your relationship that they might not have a lot of energy for? So I guess how to just be, there for your loved ones if they're suffering.
Love them. It seems incredibly simple, but sometimes I think we fall into this trap because we love people so much of what I call fixer fixation. We want to fix all their problems. We want to take their burden away from them. We just want to help. And that's, I think, a good thing. It shows that we want to help and that we care about them. But sometimes we can become so fixated on the problem that we don't see them for who they really are. We don't see the strengths as often. And this isn't, an indictment of anybody. This is what we all do because we want to help. So I think instead, sometimes some of the most effective ways of helping people who are struggling is doing the stuff that doesn't seem like it's helping at all. Talking to them about things that aren't their illness, talking to them about things that aren't their problems. Because I experienced this with my own long-term severe and persistent depression, wherein I felt like everybody was just trying to fix me, like I was a broken down car on the side of the road, and that nobody really wanted to just talk about movies or sports or music. And that was the stuff that was really relationship building. And we see this in counseling relationships too. You're not their counselor, of course, if you're their family member. But most psychotherapies work more or less the same, with a bit of an advantage for cognitive behavioral therapy, probably because it's so standardized. But what seems to be the one of the key mechanisms of action is the clinical fit, the clinical relationship. So that's really the driving force, I think, that breaks down loneliness, that helps people to be truly themselves, that relaxes people out of that rigidity, is that sense of comfort and safety, security, and secure attachment. So I think doing things that help with that is one of the most effective ways we can help people to know that they're loved and supported. Only then, when that person is able to get to the state of change where they feel safe and secure and are willing to take more risks to get help, because getting help, reaching out, is risky. Only then, when they feel supported and loved and connected, is that more likely to then be successful, to take those small steps. So we can then layer in some of the more formal supports after that. But I think that first step is always the relationship building and always going back to basics. How can we better find connections in a way that's helpful and appropriate and accessible to that person?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I do have to wrap up because we are at the end of our program today, but I just want to say that, thank you all for your insight. I know that probably a lot of our audience members had something to take away from this conversation, something meaningful that could sort of help them, get through this pandemic and beyond, and help their loved ones as well. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the Walrus for organizing this conversation and for giving us the space to do this today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Nadine Youssef, our moderator tonight, Toronto Star mental health reporter, where you can follow her work. And thanks again to our speakers, Wency Leung, Dr. Andres Lozano, Sope Owaje, and Mark Hennick. We have another mental health discussion in the works. It's an article club. So think book club, but for busy people. And this is going to be around Lisa Whittington Hill's recent viral piece in the Walrus, OCD is Not a Joke. And we've asked Mark Hennick to join her, along with journalist Anna Meller-Paperney. It will be on our Facebook page, so please follow us there. Just go to facebook.com, type in the Walrus, and you'll get more details once it's posted. Also, keep an eye on your inbox. You will receive a follow-up email to this event. And if you don't want to miss events like this in the future, the best way to stay in touch with the Walrus is to join our newsletter, and you need to opt in. So directions in the follow-up email. At the Walrus, we believe that trustworthy journalism is an essential service. And with your support, we can continue to provide fact-based, fact-checked, long-form journalism that Canadians can rely on, especially right now in the pandemic. So if you enjoyed tonight's event, which was free, please consider making a donation at thewalrus.ca. Click on donate. All gifts $20 or more receive a tax receipt. Thank you to Vivian Poupon, Katie Shingler, and everyone at Brain Canada for making tonight's conversation possible. Thank you to our annual sponsors, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Air Canada, and Shaw. Community is really important in these COVID times, as we discussed tonight, especially with mental health, even when some of us have Zoom fatigue. So thank you for joining us. Each one of you is part of the Walrus. Merci, miigwech. Thank you. Have a good evening.